Hello and welcome back to Like Maria. Today I'm going to talk to you about another poem of the decade. So this will be useful for Edexcel Pearson A-Level English Literature. Please like and subscribe and let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about Material by Ros Barber. That can be found on page 10 of your anthology. And I'm going to do that by considering half an essay question. So you're aware that for Edexcel you need to do a comparative question. I'm going to just do the question on Ros Barber's poem, but obviously in the exam you'd have an unseen that you would compare with. So my essay question is going to be: compare how both poets explore the process of grief in Ros Barber's Material. So in Ros Barber's poem Material, I'm going to talk about three aspects of grief and the process of grieving that I would want to include in an essay on this topic. So I'm going to look at this poem in terms of three aspects of grief. One is how the voice in the poem is prompted to grieve the past. One is the actual grief over the mother. And the last is her ability for acceptance of her mother's death and to move on a little from that grief. I think it's notable that Ros Barber had lost her mother a little while before writing this poem, so that's really important to have as a context background. So let's start off. An aspect of grief clearly presented in this poem is remembrance of the past. Here we get a very clear visual memory of things that have happened in the past. Now, obviously, we've got the handkerchief and we've got the old-fashioned handkerchiefs, an embarrassment of lace. They're made of cloth. And the grieving process is prompted by this memory. So Ros Barber builds this poem around this symbol of the handkerchief. And for her, the symbol of the handkerchief reminds her of her mother, who used it to mop up the corners of your grief, and who was a soft, caring mother. She is prompted to remember all the things that are connected with those times of the handkerchief, which is connecting with her mother. So if you like, she's talking about the material things, the material of the handkerchief, but also the objects that are part of that life. She talks about headscarves, girdles and knitting wool, things that are not so frequent in our society at the moment. She talks about department stores versus shopping malls. And she talks about the family process of being together, of having snotty noses, of Christmas times. She talks in particular about the different shops that she remembers. And she talks about loss through this image of the hanky and through this image of things gone. In stanza 5 we have, and somehow with the hanky's loss, greengrocer George with his dodgy foot delivering veg from a comma van is history. And I think that's a key moment here in this poem. That line starts, is history, and is stopped with the comma there, that caesura, a break in the line, which pauses and makes the narrator, this first person narrator, think about everything that's gone in the past and kind of demonstrates how she is cut off from those things now. So remembering the past is a huge part of this poem. I would also urge you to look at the metre in this poem. In the first stanza, it's very regular iambic metre. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. If you contrast that with the last stanza, but it isn't mine, I'll let it go. My mother too, eventually. There is a hint of the iambic metre there, but it's broken and disrupted. And I would suggest that the iambic metre at the beginning of the poem suggests a regularity and a familiarity. The breakdown, although it's not completely broken in the last stanza, is suggesting there an uncertainty, combined with some of the metre that preceded it. So the regular rhythm and rhyme at the beginning of the poem is faded out a little bit towards the end. Moving on to my next point, in this section I'm going to talk about how she compares herself to her mother and her grief specifically for her mother. There is a real contrast that runs throughout this poem. My mother was the hanky queen, and she clearly suggests that she wasn't. There's never a hanky up my sleeve. So throughout the poem there's what her mother was and then what she was compared to it. She bought her own. I never did. I raised neglected looking kids, the kind whose noses strangers clean. In contrast to her mother, who cleaned her daughter's nose. So there is a massive contrast between herself and her mother here, and this kind of nostalgia that she has for those days of her mother, but also a recognition that she's got her own life. And she's struggling really to think about her mother and not feel guilt that she didn't emulate her mother, not feel guilt about having her job and not cooking biscuits. She put the telly on so that the children could be entertained while she wrote this poem. So there's an important contrast here, and this is part of what Barbara is suggesting is the grieving process. The contrast between herself and her mother makes her feel guilty, makes her think of how perhaps she hasn't been as good as her mother, and makes her ponder about the relationship that she had with her mother. So in terms of the process of grieving, she is grieving by thinking back and comparing herself and examining her own role as a mother in contrast with her own mother. I think also important here, in my third section that I would talk about, is the way that the voice in the poem gradually moves towards acceptance. And this is a really key moment of the poem, right at the end when she hears her mother's voice. Her mother says, "This is your material, to do with, daughter, what you will." And here it's almost as if the daughter has been seeking permission from the mother to let go. She feels guilty perhaps about letting go, but she wants reassurance, and the mother gives her reassurance. There's a little smile at the end of this poem, the mother and daughter connecting in this way. And I think the key thing about this poem, if we're looking at grief, is this idea of material. The daughter now has material that was bequeathed her to her mother. Her mother made her into the woman that she is. She now has material in order to become her own person. And the mother is giving her that permission, and the voice in the poem is accepting that permission and trying to articulate it. She is talking about the material of her job, the material that she's got now. She has the substance of this poem is her material. She is working with different material. Her job is not to have a comforting handkerchief made of cloth and softness and baked cookies. Her job is to write that softness and that comfort into her words, into the poetry. And there is a slow realisation of the potential of the poem here to do that, and the potential of the role of her life. So in terms of the grieving process, I would suggest that this poet, and through the voice in the poem, has completed some stages of grieving. She's grieved the past, she's grieving her mother, and she's now able to let go and begin to step towards a new life where poetry is her material. So there are my thoughts on the grief process in this great poem from Ros Barber. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for another Poem of the Decade.